They had lived on opposite sides of the same creek for 20 years, both widowed, both stubborn, and both long accustomed to carrying their lives alone. But when a dry season threatened the water that kept their ranches alive, hardship forced them back into each other's orbit. Somewhere between broken dams, cold nights, and the fight for what was theirs, something neither of them expected began to take root. The water gauge read 4 inches on a Thursday morning, 3 inches below where it should have been that late in September. Standing in the mud at the creek bank, Ruth Calder understood that the dry season had finally said what it meant. She had been watching the creek drop since August, telling herself it would correct itself as it always did. Now, in the 3rd week of September, she was done lying to herself. In the south pasture, the cattle had already started nosing farther down the bank than she liked. She tested the posts, checked the base fittings, and walked the bank upstream for a quarter mile, reading the waterline stains on the rocks. 3 weeks of dropping, maybe more. The blockage, whatever it was, sat on the north bank, Edmund Hale's side, where she couldn't reach it without crossing his land. She had shared this creek with Edmund Hale by a handshake agreement for 20 years, first with her husband Thomas, and then without him. The handshake was never renegotiated because neither of them had seen a reason to change something that worked. There was an old filing somewhere in the county records, but the daily truth of it had always been that handshake. Edmund's property ran the north bank, hers ran the south. The water moved between them the way things move between neighbors who have decided, without ever quite saying so, that some things are held in common. Ruth went home, grabbed her coat, and rode to his gate. Edmund came to the door still holding a wrench. She told him about the gauge reading and the sign of a blockage upstream, beaver work, from the look of it, on the north bank. He listened to everything before he spoke, turning the wrench once in his hand. "I can go this afternoon," he said. "I'll go with you," Ruth replied. "It's my water, too." He looked at her for a moment, not with resistance, but with the expression of a man who had expected exactly that answer. "I need to finish what I'm in the middle of," he said. Ruth nodded and rode home. They found 3 dams, not 2. The beavers had been working since August. She could see it in the dried mud and stripped branches. The damage had settled into itself over weeks. The blockage had been building while she watched the gauge and waited. She did not say this out loud, and Edmund did not say it either. He waded into the first dam with his bar and went to work. Ruth took the downstream side, and they broke it apart in sections. The cold water pushed against their boots, and dark mud rose around every step. By the 3rd dam, the water was over her boot tops, but she kept at it because there was nothing else to do. They worked the last of the branches free together, and finally the dam broke. The creek came loose under their hands, brown at first, then quick and clear over the stones. Ruth straightened up and watched the water moving the way it was supposed to. The sun was low through the cottonwood leaves, throwing light across the surface toward both their properties. Edmund pulled off his gloves and wrung them out. "Creek's going," he said, watching the flow. "It is." She looked downstream. "I should have caught the blockage in August." He turned to face her. "Creek's going now." He went to gather his tools, and Ruth stood there a moment before gathering hers. She made supper because it was past the hour, and sending him home after what they'd done would have felt like the wrong kind of statement. He sat at her table without ceremony. She put beans and cornbread in front of him and sat across from him. They talked through what the creek would need through October and whether the beavers would require another pass in the spring. After a while, he set down his fork. Clara used to say water problems were like tooth problems, he mused. Ignore them long enough and eventually the tooth comes out. Ruth looked at her plate. Thomas said the same thing about fences. She turned a piece of cornbread over in her hand. Said it every year. We ignored it anyway. Lost 2 steers in '91. Edmund looked up. There was a particular recognition in his eyes, the look of people who have survived the same weather without ever having planned to survive it side by side. He held her gaze for a moment, then went back to his food. The lamp sat between them, the stove worked its steady heat into the corners of the room, and the evening settled in around the house. Ruth had eaten alone at this table for 4 years. Thomas had sat where Edmund sat now, but Thomas had been a man who occupied a room without truly filling it. The house had not changed much when he died, and Ruth had understood something about her marriage in that realization, something she usually kept tucked away. After supper, Edmund carried his plate to the basin and took his hat from the hook. He stopped at the door. Gate latch on your south pen is going. Noticed it on the way in. I know it, she said. It's on my list. He nodded once and went out. She listened to his horse leave the yard and stood at the basin for a long moment before going to bed. October came in dry and stayed that way. Edmund found reasons to be useful that Ruth did not examine too carefully. A fence section her hired man hadn't finished, or a troubled line feeding the east trough. He took to stopping by on Mondays after checking his north fence, though neither called it a habit. She returned the favors in kind without keeping a ledger. The accounting between them had always been inexact by design. Eventually, she started hearing his horse in the yard a moment before it actually arrived. She noticed this, but she didn't let herself dwell on it. Florence Marsh visited on a Tuesday afternoon with the careful warmth of a woman who had organized her concern before arriving. She stood at the porch rail and spoke about Edmund the way one speaks about a problem that needs attending. She mentioned a woman from the valley, established, sensible. Then Florence looked at Ruth with a sharpness disguised as kindness. She said Ruth had built something real here, and that hope could be a costly thing when it got ahead of what had actually been offered. After Florence's buggy raised its dust going north, Ruth stood at the rail and felt those words sit heavy in her chest. They landed because they were partly true. She had been reaching, or near enough to it that the distinction didn't matter. Inside, she stood at the stove with the burner going and nothing on it. Thomas had been a decent man. He worked beside her and was never unkind. But he had been somewhere else most of the time. She had learned over 20 years not to expect his full presence, a lesson so well learned she had stopped noticing the absence. What she had not done in 4 years alone was want something. She had protected herself with work and the knowledge that she was sufficient. But Edmund was there. That was the plain fact of it. He came when the water needed working. He noticed things. He did not make her feel like a problem he was solving. She put the thought away, but she did so carefully, the way you set aside something you intend to come back to. The fever hit her on a Monday. By Tuesday morning, it had made its intentions clear. She had felt it building since Saturday, but told herself October had no room for sickness. By the time she fed the stock Monday morning, the illness stopped asking for permission. She made it back to the house, sat at the kitchen table, and realized she wasn't going to be doing anything else that day. She got herself to bed, but didn't think to latch the door. She didn't hear him come in, only the sounds of the kitchen, the stove, the pump, the movement of someone who knew what they were looking for. Then he was in the doorway, taking in the room the way he took in any problem. He put the back of his hand to her forehead. "How long?" he asked. "Since Saturday. I didn't think it was this." He pulled Thomas's chair from the corner, set it beside the bed, and sat down. "Your stock is done. I'll get the evening around." She started to tell him he didn't have to, but he looked at her with an expression that was both patient and final. "I know that," he said. She stopped arguing, not because she lacked a point, but because she didn't actually want him to leave, and she was too tired to pretend otherwise. He stayed through both nights, replacing the compresses and offering water whenever she surfaced. Once, deep in the second night, she said his name without meaning to. He told her he was there. She believed him and drifted back under. The fever broke Wednesday morning. She lay still in the quiet of a body that had finished its argument. She could smell coffee. When she made it to the kitchen, Edmund was at the stove. He pulled the chair closest to the heat for her. He put coffee, then eggs in front of her and let her eat in silence. Outside, the horses moved in the pen, and the morning sat cold and still. After a while, she told him he hadn't needed to stay 2 nights. He wrapped both hands around his cup. "That Southgate latch, I'll fix it before I go." Ruth looked at him across the table. "You mentioned that latch in August." He looked down into his cup. "I remember." "That was 2 months ago, Edmund." He met her eyes. "Wasn't the right time yet." A silence sat between them that was neither uncomfortable nor small. Ruth looked back at her coffee, Edmund looked at the window, and the morning moved on. She thanked him before he left. He lifted a hand, not quite a wave, but the gesture of a man who had received what he needed and required nothing more. She watched him from the window as he went to fix the latch. The diversion proposal came on a Friday in November. Ruth found out from the land agent, Purvis, a man who tracked ownership but often forgot that right and ownership weren't the same thing. A ranching concern wanted to redirect the creek's upstream flow. Purvis claimed it was legal if downstream users agreed. He looked at Ruth as if a widow's water rights were merely a manageable inconvenience. He told her Edmund had already been contacted and found the proposal worth considering. Ruth drove home, refusing to think clearly about that last part until she was on her own road. Edmund was at her gate when she arrived. "Purvis tell you?" he asked. "He did," she said, keeping her hands on the reins. "He said you found it worth considering." Edmund looked at the ground, then back at her. "I told him I'd need to look at the downstream impact before I said anything. That's not the same thing as considering it." He turned his hat in his hands. "They sent the proposal to me first. Left you off the initial paperwork. I noticed that. I told Purvis the creek serves 2 properties and both owners needed to be at any meeting. He tried to say your share was secondary by the county record." He paused, then added flatly, "I told him it was not secondary by any standing that mattered." Ruth sat with that. The afternoon light was going cold across the fields. The creek was running exactly as it was supposed to. "Come inside," she said. "I'll put coffee on." They worked through the proposal together. They did the math on what the diversion would do to the gauge by midsummer. By August, it would take the shallows, then the lower troughs, then the grass. The cattle would be leaning through fences for grass that wasn't there. They arrived at the same answer. They wrote a joint response, both signed it, and Ruth delivered it to Purvis on Monday. "The creek has run between both properties for 20 years, she told the agent. "It serves both equally. Any proposal requires the consent of both owners, and that consent is not given." She spoke with the steel of a woman who had held land alone for 4 years. Without both signatures, the proposal was dead. Florence Marsh was in the office that morning and saw the signatures. She gave Ruth a small nod, not warm but honest. A reassessment. November turned into December. Edmund came in the evenings, Ruth made supper, and they fell into a pattern they didn't discuss. They talked about grazing plans, and then they talked about Missouri, Ohio, and the choice of leaving home young. Ruth found herself saying things she hadn't said in years, ordinary facts of a life she had stopped telling because there was no one to listen. One evening, Edmund looked at his cup. "My son wrote from Colorado again, asking if I'd thought more about selling and moving up there. Told him the same thing I told him in October. I am where I intended to be." Moody. Combien? The silence that followed had a particular texture. It meant more than what was said. Ruth held that silence carefully and went back to her plate. The night it happened was a Thursday. Supper was over, the dishes were done, and the stove was banked. There was no practical reason for either of them to still be sitting at the table. Neither moved for the door. Edmund set his cup down and looked at her, not with his problem-solving look, but the other one, the one that had been staying open longer lately. "I'm not good at talking around things," he said. "So I'll say it plain. I'd like to marry you, Ruth. I think you already know that, and I would rather say it plainly than let another winter go by with both of us knowing it and neither of us saying so." The wind pressed at the window. A log shifted in the stove. Ruth looked at this man who had stood up for her rights, who had sat by her sickbed, and who had noticed a broken latch in August but waited for the right time to fix it. She had been watching him for 20 years. She had become so good at not needing anything that she'd forgotten what that independence cost her. It had been costing her something steady, the way a creek loses an inch at a time. She reached across the table and took his hand. He closed his around hers with the care of a man who knew the value of what he was holding. "Yes," she said. "I should have said so sooner." A long, slow release moved through him. The careful part of him finally found a place where it didn't have to be so guarded. He looked at her steadily. "It's my water, too." Sigh. The words carried everything back to that day at the creek bank in September, to the moment he realized she understood him completely. They married on a Saturday in January under a pale New Mexico sky. The town came, as towns do when a thing has been decided, long before the ceremony. Even Florence Marsh was there, looking genuinely glad. The ride home was quiet, the kind of quiet that has nothing left to say. On a morning in March, Ruth came in from the creek, her fingers cold. Edmund was at the stove. 7 inches, she said. He looked at her, something open and unhurried in his face. He gave a small, knowing snort and turned back to the stove. "Sit down, it's ready." Through the window, the morning light burned the frost off the south pasture. A meadowlark started up from the fence line, one long note, then another, until the yard filled with the sound of a country that had wintered through. Edmund's son came from Colorado that spring, and Ruth's daughter came in June. By the second summer, both were arriving at the same time to help with the work. They worked the properties side by side. Edmund and Ruth noticed, but said nothing for a while. Then, one evening, Edmund set his cup down with a look, and Ruth said she had been thinking the same thing. That was the whole of the conversation. The children married that October. Afterward, the outer fences stayed, but the fence between the two properties came down section by section. The wire was rolled, the post pulled, and the land opened into one unbroken run. The gauge post stayed where it had always stood, but the water it measured now ran through land that no longer held itself apart. In the evenings, both houses showed lights in the windows. Smoke from both chimneys went up into the same sky. The families moved between the two kitchens the way people do when the distance between them has finally stopped meaning anything. These stories are written for those who know that the best things arrive slowly. If this tale meant something to you, let us know in the comments. Thank you for spending time with Dustin Hart Western Tales.